Thanks again for joining us for our webinar, Planning for Coastal Resiliency in Northwest Michigan's Dunes. I'm Sarah Lucas from Networks Northwest, and we're joined here today with John Paskis from the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. We're going to be presenting a short webinar to explain a project that we've conducted over the last year or so with funding from the DEQ's Coastal Zone Management Program. We are going to be sharing with you some resources on
Hey, Elizabeth, look like you cut out, maybe? Are you there?
Now, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Hey, sorry about that, guys. It looks like we're having some connectivity issues and it kind of kicked us out. Hopefully that doesn't happen again, but should we have any more issues, we'll be sharing this webinar and resources available on our website, and we'll be sure to contact you with all that information so that we get a do-over on the webinar. Hopefully it doesn't come to that. But my apologies, and please bear with us as we kind of run through that. I'm not sure where you lost me, but I was just explaining our project partners on this webinar, and the associated resources are the Michigan Natural Features Inventory and the DEQ's Coastal Zone Management Program. We started working together about a year and a half ago to develop this coastal resiliency resource with funding from the Coastal Zone Management Program. The Michigan Natural Features Inventory worked with us to digitize dune data and create some new online mapping resources for local government officials and other stakeholders working along the Northwest Michigan coast. And John Paskis here with us today is going to be sharing information on that particular aspect of the program. We at Networks Northwest worked with John and the Coastal Zone Management Program to develop some resources and best practices related to protecting those dunes at the local government level. And as part of that, we developed a planning guidebook, and we're going to be introducing that here today and making that available on our website. Our agenda here this morning is John's going to go through some of the new mapping resources, and then I'm going to just share a little bit on the guidebook and some of the resources and information that went into that, and we'll make those available again on our website after the webinar is over. So I'm going to turn it over to John, and John, I'm not sure if you have access. I think that we're not going to turn it over to John just yet.
Got one more to go.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to give just a quick intro to coastal resiliency and why we're engaged in this project. For those of you that aren't real familiar with that term, it means the ability of a community to bounce back after hazardous events like floods and coastal storms, rather than simply reacting to impacts. So it's a more proactive approach to some of the environmental hazards we have along the coast, and it's something that's become a real big priority, particularly in the face of issues like we saw with Hurricane Sandy a few years ago. I think it's really come to public consciousness after that event. In Northwest Michigan, coastal resiliency is a big priority because we have so much coastline, and so much of that is covered by fairly dynamic features like dunes and bluffs. In Northwest Michigan, we have over 38,000 acres of dunes. In addition to that, we have a lot of high-risk erosion areas, sandy beaches, bluffs. All of those features are very dynamic and need to remain so in order to function properly within the ecosystem. They're particularly vulnerable to hazards like erosion. We have all probably seen what happens when bluffs erode and understand what that can do to development in and around those dunes or bluffs. It can be hazardous both to property and to human life. So we need to be very careful about how those areas are developed, in order to ensure that, we're safe and that the ecosystem remains functional and viable. So we wanted to look at how we can most appropriately develop in those areas, or if there is in fact a way to develop appropriately in those areas, or if it's better served by permanent conservation. We wanted to kind of catalog the resources that are out there and identify the areas that local governments need to be aware of when they're planning and zoning for a functional, viable ecosystem in the future. So that's where we began working with the Natural Features Inventory. They helped us identify the coastal areas that we need to be thinking about when we're planning for coastal resiliency. And as I mentioned earlier, Networks Northwest kind of put together some resources for when communities embark on that resiliency effort, what their roles might be in that. John's going to share some information on the mapping resources that are available, and then we'll get into the guidebook information. So John, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. My name is John Paskus. I'm with the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. And we're going to be testing my resiliency today because I came down with a horrible head cold Sunday night. And good thing it wasn't yesterday, because I was definitely not functional at all. So we'll see how I go today. If I sound incoherent at times, you'll know what's going on there. So our task, we really had sort of two tasks as part of this project. And you know what, it is not moving forward. Key for me on your end. So we had two tasks. One was to come up with a more accurate mapping of the coastal dunes, and the second one was to map. We got a note from Tom Kucera that he's not receiving the audio. Okay, can you hit the next button? Okay, so those are the two things that we're focused on. The Humphreys Shoretypes is, I'll talk about that, but that was developed on hard copy maps back in the 1950s. And it's kind of a unique data set that a lot of people have been wanting to have available digitally for a variety of different uses. And so we thought this was a great opportunity to see what that information might be able to provide us. Okay, so mapping coastal dunes. Why do we need to do that? Well, there was an effort that was put forth back in the late 70s, early 80s to map the critical dunes as part of the Sand Dunes Act of Michigan. And in 1996, there was actually an effort put forth by MSU to make those maps digitally available and to modify them according to some of the new policies that were put into place. So that was done and available, I think, in '96. And a lot of people aren't aware that that data set exists out there. So that's the critical dune data set, but that is specific criteria. So there are we felt there were other dunes out there that were not being included as part of that data set. So we went and, by the way, somebody has some background noise going on back there. If you could make sure your microphone is muted, that'd be appreciated. Thanks. So we went and looked at soils data. There's a ton of data available through SERGO. It's a national soils data set. And that provided a wealth of information. This one right here is showing where we have a high degree of topographic relief in one of the embayments with open dunes. Can you hit the next button? We got like a little lag. There we go. The good old USGS topo quads, those are available digitally as well for the entire state. And as you can see, seeing those topographic boundaries in many cases really helps to define where those dunes are. More importantly, actually, we developed a classification, a very simple classification for dunes to make it a little bit more meaningful than just whether it's a dune or not. And in this particular case, you can see this is in Frankfurt, I believe, and you can see this is a perched dune, as a high perched dune as opposed to a low perched dune. All right, next, the MNFI database. So we have a database, if you're not familiar with Michigan Natural Features Inventory, of all of the listed species, special concern species, as well as high quality or very rare natural communities in the state. And so we were able to tap into that, obviously, and we don't have a necessarily very good dunes classification. We basically have open dunes and wooded dune and swale complexes that we track. But again, especially for wooded dune and swale complexes, that was very, very helpful. Next. Aerial imagery. Anybody that's been playing around at all on their computer knows that aerial imagery is easily available anywhere you go, even on your phone. We use it on a daily basis, and that aerial imagery was extremely helpful, especially in just determining the differences between vegetated dunes versus open dunes. And last, this is a cool data set right here. This is again, like some of the other data sets, this was hard copy only. This was done back in response to the Sand Dunes Act, done by Buckler in 78, 79. And he actually not only mapped the dunes onto 15-minute quadrangle maps, but he also came up with his own classification. It's a very complicated classification, so we didn't attempt to try to duplicate that. But it's a really great resource. Great story behind it is that I must have contacted 20, 25 people to track this down. And it finally found a fellow over in DEQ, John Esch, who works for the Geologic Surveys. And he remembered, he actually has used these maps before. Turns out they were in a garage over by the Lansing Airport. And in some corner, and he was able to find them and provide them for us. That was a great resource. Okay, next. So this is just a couple of the results that we got out of that mapping effort. When we combined the different types together, we came up with about 48 dune sites in the 7 counties and the islands in the Northwest Lower Peninsula, totaling about a little over 38,000 acres. And there's quite a variance in size of those sites, but the largest site you're seeing here, if you connect all those different types together, this is over in Wilderness State Park area that stretches down through Sturgeon Bay, southward into Cross Village. And that, I can't remember the exact size of that, but that was by far the largest dune site that we have, followed by Sleeping Bear Dunes, of course. What was interesting about this effort is that we ended up mapping 10,400 more acres than was mapped as part of the designated critical dunes mapping effort back in the 90s. So that doesn't mean every site was bigger. Some sites actually disappeared, some sites shrank, some sites got bigger, and there were some new sites added as well. Another interesting note is that 75% of the dunes were in some kind of public ownership. Could be a township park, Could be conservancy land, could be National Park Service over in Sleeping Bear Dunes, of course. But that was kind of nice to know that you know, the majority of those dune sites are in some kind of public ownership. Next. I talked about that we created this really kind of simplified dune classification. As in doing that, we came up with 9 different types of dunes. And what we did is we looked at how it was formed. So we have parabolic dunes, which are your sort of classic example of what a dune looks like. If you think of like P.J. Hoffmaster State Park or Cathead Bay, those are parabolic dunes. Wooded dune and swale complexes. In the green, in that lime green color that you see on this map over in Sleeping Bear Dunes area, those are all dune and swale complexes. These are these sort of dunes with ridges that can go on for several miles inland that were just formed as the Great Lakes, as Lake Michigan in this case, receded over time. Those are pretty plentiful, especially in this portion of the state. And then there was a sort of in-betweener that we called a complex dune field. It's sort of an amalgamation of different dune formations. So those are the 3 formation types. I mentioned earlier perched, so there's low perched and high perched. This basically, is it down at lake level, or is it up on a bluff like you can see over in the Frankfurt area? And then whether or not it was vegetated or open. So that was our simple classification that we came up with. And some sites like the one we saw up there in Wilderness State Park or down here in Sleeping Bear Dunes had really high dune diversity. Most cases, it's just 1 or 2 types, but there are some pretty cool places out there. And it's no wonder that those places ended up getting protected, which is good news. And overall, if you just wanted to say, okay, of those 9 types, which one contained the most acres of dunes? By far, it was the wooded dune and swale complexes. They make up about 42% of the total acres, or over 16,000 acres in this case, in the Northwest Lower Peninsula. Next. Opportunities. So one of the things we were able to look at, thanks to Networks Northwest, is we were able to look at dunes according to their ownership patterns. And as I said, 75% are in public ownership, but that doesn't mean every dune is 75 and 25. Some of the dunes are 100% private. So in this simple Excel table here, there's a listing. I think there's 23 or 24 sites where they were over 100 acres in size, and they were at least 50% privately owned. So here are the opportunities, I think, for either local units of government or conservancies to go out and either do landowner contact, do some outreach work, or potentially do some proactive conservation work on those private lands. So if you can, I think I did. I arranged them by county, and so you can see a lot of them are in Manistee, Benzie County, as well as Charlevoix. Most of the Charlevoix sites, actually, I think all of the Charlevoix sites are on Beaver Island. So Beaver Island is clearly a place where there isn't a whole lot of dune protection from a public ownership standpoint, and certainly some opportunity there to do some proactive work on private lands. Okay, next. So the second thing we did, as I mentioned, there was this real interest in mapping these Humphrey Shoretypes that were done in the 50s. And those were mapped by Humphreys and his students. I think he was out of MSU. And so this was done by foot and by boat. And the initial reason for doing this was actually to promote cottage development, which is really fascinating to think about. There were 113, I think, across the state using their methodology. what was really, I think, eye-opening for me anyways, was the amount of data that they had collected. They looked at soil types, they looked at slope, bluff and bluff height, beach width, and they looked at not only the dry beach, but the wet beach. So I think they went in to the water up to the point where I think it was 6 feet deep was their cutoff. They looked at vegetation types, erosion potential, which is probably the most interesting aspect of it for this particular project. They also looked at the uplands and, what was going on in the uplands, and they had note fields. So there's a lot of data to be mined out of that database. And now it's digitized, it's available for the Northwest Lower Peninsula, and that data set is attributed. Next. So as I said, erosion potential, I think, in terms of thinking about coastal resiliency is a really cool idea. And as many people have pointed out to me anyway, is that through the high-risk erosion area program that the state runs, very few areas have actually been evaluated for erosion potential. It's just a very time-consuming process where not a lot of resources have been put towards that program. So it turns out that even though this is in many ways a coarse resolution view of the shoreline, a lot of folks have found it very useful. And so in this case, what we're showing in the red on the right side there, map of the Lower Peninsula, is the medium to high areas that are prone to erosion. So you can see there's a big swath there where you have sleeping bear dunes occurring over on the far west side of the state. Okay, next. So where do you get this information? We created two places to go to. One is an ArcGIS online map that you can actually go to and download the data if you want. You can view it in the map viewer that's provided, or you can actually view it in ArcGIS if you have ArcGIS on your computer. And the second one is a story map that we created. And the story map is an Esri GIS tool that a lot of folks have just recently sort of become aware of. And so we explored it and created a Coastal Dunes of Michigan story map for the Northwest Lower Peninsula that kind of takes you through all the stuff that we did and the connection to the Network's Northwest Guidebook. So that's a really good resource. Here's Elizabeth just turned us over to the ArcGIS online map, and so it's got I think showing right here are all the dune sites. You can zoom in and zoom out. It's going to be a little bit delayed here. And then you can click on these different layers to see what you want to see. You can also turn on different base maps as well. So if you go to base map over here, if you're not familiar with this tool, you can do satellite imagery, you can do the streets map, you can do terrain, topo maps, really anything that you want to use as a backdrop. And we've got the different data layers here, and you can, as I said, download them. You can also filter them in this application that's available. So here are the erosion, the Humphreys shore types. Here's the critical dune sites. Let me click these off for now. So you can see how simple it is. Here are the different dune types that we have. And then you can even go in and look at the sites that were created in that last table that I just showed that are mostly private, the 23, 24 sites out there. So that's available to everybody. You just have to link to that site, and Networks Northwest has a link on their website that'll take you directly to that site. The second thing that we created was this story map of coastal dunes, and there's I'll just take you through it real quick. There's an introduction here of dunes in that area and why we did this project. There's a little write-up on designated critical dunes and how that happened. And then there are maps that go along with these different write-ups. So here's a story on the rest of the dunes beyond the critical dunes. How big and where. Here's sort of a cool breakdown of the different types. So you can see wooded dune and swale makes up the majority, but parabolic dunes, you know, there's a lot more of them, and they're kind of closing in. And dune fields are much rarer in this part of the state. And that'll be interesting to see if we ever get a chance to do the remainder of the state, to see how that plays out. And you can see percent public ranges between 63% and 84% overall. And then there's the story behind the numbers here with a focus on what's happening there in Sleeping Bear Dunes, the different dune types and locations. So all the things that I just sort of talked about, you can learn more about each of those types. Like here's a write-up on wooded dune and swale complexes, and there's some hot links here to MNFI abstracts that we've developed over the years on wooded dune and swale complexes and the different species like Blanding's turtle and the different raptors that are associated with that system. Here's a write-up on parabolic dunes. So sort of similar with some more hot links. Taking some time, this is a close-up of Cathead Bay and Leelanau Peninsula, where you can see the parabolic dunes and the difference between the open portion of the dune and the vegetated portion. And then you click over here, we got more stuff. We got the critical dune fields. There's a picture over here of a critical dune field over at Fisherman's Island State Park. And then here's an aerial of the biggest complex dune field in the state over the classic Sleeping Bear Dune. This is where the dune climb is. It takes you over into Lake Michigan. And then we've got a tab over here on what to do with this information. So here's a focus on those private sites. And again, these maps are interactive. So you can see here are I mentioned Beaver Island, so I'm going to zoom in on that guy. And here are the dune sites that are on Beaver Island that are predominantly privately owned. And then, of course, we have to acknowledge our funders. And last but not least, we have additional sources of information. So there was a project that was done by MEC, Brad Garman's online, and there were several partners involved. And so there's a link there. This is in the background is a story map that Calvin College actually had put together based on their vast experience working with dunes in the southwest part of the state. And so they have a really excellent story map on everything you wanted to know about dunes in Michigan. There's also a link to the MEC Management of Michigan Dunes website, as well as a booklet that I put together years ago. Gosh, probably back in the late 80s, maybe. It's been a while, but it's a timeless piece called Born in the Wind. If you haven't seen it, it's really an excellent resource. I just clicked on it by accident. Let's see if it'll work. Denny Albert, if anybody remembers, Denny Albert was one of our longtime ecologists, and he spearheaded this project. There it is. So you guys might have recognized that cover of that book, and Denny was the lead author of that, with a lot of contributions from different folks. So, Elizabeth and Sarah, I don't know if you want to do questions now or if you want to get through your portion of the project or the presentation and then do all the questions at the end.
I think we're probably going to take all the questions at the end. It might just be
okay. That sounds great.
More efficient. So if you have questions, you can type them in now, and we'll get to those towards the end of the presentation. So I'm going to share some information about the guidebook that I mentioned earlier on. We started working with natural features inventory to kind of get a handle on what we have in Northwest Michigan in terms of dunes, and I really appreciate all the mapping resources that John and the Michigan Natural Features Inventory have brought to the table. I think it's given us a really good sense of what we need to be thinking about at the local level in terms of coastal resiliency. When we talk about coastal resiliency along the shoreline, a lot of times we go straight to the state regulations for the features that we're most familiar with on dunes and bluff areas. We have a couple different acts in Michigan that protect those areas or certain parts of those areas through the critical dunes and high-risk erosion area regulations. The issue is that those those regulations don't address dunes and bluffs and other coastal areas in their entirety. They take kind of a piecemeal approach. And so local governments are often in the position of filling in the gaps to make sure that coastal areas remain part of a viable, cohesive ecosystem. So they take the lead on policies, plans, and other resiliency techniques that aren't addressed by critical dunes and high-risk erosion area regulations or by other federal or state regulations that address environmental issues. They do this in a number of ways for the local governments. On the webinar, you're familiar with many of these policy activities, master plans being kind of the foremost or the most fundamental role that local governments take in environmental issues. Master plans are essentially guides for future development, and they set the stage for other activities that have a little more teeth, like zoning or conservation types of activities. But master plans are really where all of local government roles kind of have their genesis or their start. We have a really good, bar in terms of how master plans address coastal resiliency or coastal areas in Northwest Michigan. When we kind of developed this resource as part of our activities, we reviewed all the master plans and zoning ordinances of all the communities along the Lake Michigan shoreline. And as we did that, we discovered that every community in Northwest Michigan addresses environmental concerns along the coast in Northwest Michigan. So we feel like we're in a really good spot in terms of how local governments are thinking about and addressing coastal areas in the master plans. Whether or not that carries through into zoning is kind of another matter, but we'll touch on that. Another place that local governments can really get into some of the coastal area issues is through recreation planning. In Michigan, the DNR kind of administers a grant source called the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund that has provided a lot of funding to conserve areas as natural areas or public recreation areas, and has been a very high impact funding source in Northwest Michigan in terms of conservation in the past. So we have a lot of communities that when they do their recreation plans, they identify areas that they want to conserve or protect. Sometimes those are dune areas or coastal areas. And by planning for that in their recreation plans that are later approved by the DNR, they become eligible for funding through that Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund grant program. And we have, as one example, Alberta Dunes was purchased with funding from that grant program after being included in a recreation plan. So those are an important policy document to consider when you're thinking about coastal resiliency, when you're talking about conservation. Conservation in and of itself is an important role for local governments to play. In our guidebook, we identify some of the ways that local governments can prioritize conservation, how they can identify different areas that might be higher priority protection areas, and some of the funding sources that might go into that. Another activity that counties are very involved in cooperation with emergency management personnel is planning for hazard mitigation. Every county in Northwest Michigan has a hazard mitigation plan that's been adopted both at the county level and by the Michigan State Police, and later approved by FEMA. These hazard mitigation plans are required in the event of a federal emergency. If you're applying for emergency management dollars, you need to have a hazard mitigation plan that's been adopted. Hazard mitigation plans go through, where a community might be most vulnerable to environmental issues like coastal flooding or storms, and how the community will react in the event of a severe weather event or a storm. And as part of that hazard mitigation planning process, it's really important to identify areas like we're talking about here in the webinar today: high risk erosion areas, dunes, other coastal areas that might be susceptible to more severe weather events, things like erosion and flooding, so that the community can prepare for that appropriately. So hazard mitigation planning is an important role for local governments to play in terms of thinking about coastal resiliency and how the community can address those potential vulnerabilities. And then finally, when people think about local government authority and policy, a lot of times the first thing that comes to mind is zoning. That's where the rubber meets the road on a lot of these resiliency issues and needs, and really where we put a lot of focus in terms of planning for resiliency in the future. Can you advance the, please? I'm not going to get into this in a lot of detail. I just kind of wanted to give you a sense of what's in the guidebook. We go through a few different zoning techniques that impact resiliency and might be appropriate considerations in dune areas or coastal areas. Just a few of them that we have here on the slide. Shoreline protection setbacks are possibly one of the more important considerations when you're talking about zoning for resiliency, and making sure that you're taking into account all of the geographic features in a coastal area when you're siting development. It's really important in terms of erosion, potential for flooding, the stability of the site, to think about the specific geological features in terms of where that development is going to go. So shoreline protection setbacks are a really important zoning technique. Most of the zoning ordinances that we reviewed have some kind of shoreline protection measure in the zoning ordinance. So we, in the guidebook, include links to some of the better, more thoughtful examples of where you can find that in zoning ordinances. A few others that we talked about and that we have examples for in Northwest Michigan zoning ordinances are limitations on shoreline structures like seawalls or breakwaters. In that case, it's often safer and better for the ecosystem to create a natural barrier rather than a hard wall or barrier along the shoreline. And we have a few zoning ordinances that have limited or prohibited shoreline structures as a means of acting as a breakwater. So we've provided links to those examples in the guidebook. Another technique that some local governments are following is requiring environmental impact statements. It's I think a lot of people are familiar with environmental impact assessments that are required in certain environmental areas by state or federal agencies. Environmental impact statements are more focused on local mitigation efforts and potential. They ask developers or property owners to identify any potential impacts that development might have on a sensitive natural area, and then they may require as a condition of approval that those impacts be mitigated by a variety of techniques. So environmental impact statements are something that are required in a few communities in Northwest Michigan, and again, we have links to those examples in the guidebook. Some of our communities, Emmett County and Leelanau Township and Leelanau County, have very carefully addressed bluffs in their zoning ordinance. They've developed specific setbacks and development techniques for their bluff areas or dune areas. They might be called bluff protection zones. They might be called bluff setbacks, but they're very specific to the unique features that we have in dunes and high-risk erosion areas in efforts to mitigate any potential impacts of development in those areas. Another couple items that are a little more general. We have, as I mentioned, a lot of state and federal regulations that are connected to what we're trying to accomplish with local coastal resiliency efforts, like the critical dunes regulations. We also have county soil erosion and protection ordinances throughout Northwest Michigan, and some zoning ordinances or some communities will require that those permits be provided as a condition of approval, so that the local government knows and understands what other regulations that site is subject to, and making sure that they're coordinating efforts to protect those sensitive areas with state and federal regulations. So it's important to consider how those other regulations come into play at the local level. Even if you can't control them, it's important to understand how they impact the site. And then finally, overlay districts kind of take all of the above and apply it to any environmentally sensitive areas. It will, an environmental overlay district will apply on top of any other regulations that are in place on the property or in the district. So if it's a residential district, an overlay district would add regulations on top of that. And we have a couple of examples in Northwest Michigan that take all of the above, the shoreline protection setbacks, the limitations on shoreline structures, environmental impact statements, bluff protection zones, and combine that into an overlay district. So that if your property meets certain characteristics in terms of coastal features, it will be subject to all of those regulations on top of any underlying residential zoning regulations as well. This is just a kind of a quick slide to show you here, just to give you a sense of which townships and villages we reviewed in terms of zoning. We have pulled out some of the better examples of where these zoning techniques are used and provided links to them in the guidebook. So you can see how many communities are including that consideration in the zoning ordinance. And if you're looking to adopt or draft regulations in that particular realm, you have a place to start in the sense of looking at other examples from Northwest Michigan. So you can see the most common regulations that we found in Northwest Michigan are limitations on shoreline structures and requiring cluster development, which concentrates development on less environmentally sensitive parts of the site. Those are found in almost every zoning ordinance along the coast here in Northwest Michigan. Again, not a complete list on the right-hand column of all the communities that have done this, but some of the better examples if you're looking to start with regulations that have already been adopted elsewhere in Northwest Michigan. So just kind of a quick intro to what we have in the guidebook itself. In addition to that, in addition to those links that we have for zoning ordinances, we also have a number of case studies of where these different techniques have been applied. So things like, where sensitive areas have been permanently protected, where really comprehensive zoning ordinances have been adopted. We have a little bit of information on some of those bigger case studies so that you get a sense of how this looks in action. We also have some sample master plan language. So if you don't have real strong language in your master plan and or are looking to update your existing master plan, there's some language in there that you can start with in terms of addressing coastal resiliency and how that might look within the master plan. For communities that are really taking a closer look at coastal resiliency and integrating language into master plans or recreation plans or zoning ordinances, we came up with kind of a checklist and process for how you might want to go through that, beginning with collecting data, mapping natural features, getting public input on concerns and priorities for natural areas, and then actually drafting the master plan and zoning ordinance language. I mentioned we have links to adopted local zoning ordinances in Northwest Michigan, and then we also have links to the maps that John showed you earlier on the Dune type and cover maps, as well as the Coastal Resiliency story map. All of that and those links are available at our website, networksnorthwest.org/coastal resiliency, and that is going to be available, and it is available online now. So we'll leave the slide up, or we'll go back to that slide so that you can copy down that link if you're interested. So that's just a kind of a quick overview of what we've been doing and what we've made available to communities in terms of mapping and planning resources. And we have a few minutes left here that we can use for any questions that you might have. And just a quick reminder that we'll be taking questions over chat. Do we have any questions on chat?
Just a reminder, folks, don't forget that you're probably muted in case you're trying to speak up. Elizabeth, you wanna go to your website, your web page that you guys created?
We'll do that. We have a couple questions real quickly. There's one question on whether or not communities that limit shoreline structures only limit shore protection, only limit buildings, or if they also limit shore protection. And I think we have a couple of examples of communities that limit not just buildings, but also seawalls and breakwaters, I think in Charlevoix County. So I think we do have some good examples there. There's also a question here on guidelines for restoring dunes. We don't have any language on that in the guidebook. That's an excellent question. Probably something that we need to think about incorporating. Any other questions? We'd like to share our contact information. You can access Networks Northwest through the website if you want to go back to that website just to share that with people. Again, my name is Sarah Lucas. I'm from Networks Northwest. And I think everyone has Elizabeth's contact information, Elizabeth Calcutt at Networks Northwest, and can reach us with any additional questions that way. And again, our partners here, our Michigan Natural Features Inventory, John Pascas has been working with us as a partner through the Coastal Zone Management Program through the DEQ. So if we don't have any other questions, John, do you have any other information you'd like to share or any questions you'd like to put to the group?
I don't know if I have any more information, but thinking of maybe a question for you guys would be, did you see anything interesting when you looked at spatial patterns and local ordinances or other tools? Was there anything that kind of stood out to you? Were there any major gaps that need to be addressed?
I think that, you know, when we looked at the results of the mapping, probably the data point that interested me the most or impressed me the most was the amount of dune coverage that's in public ownership, which I think puts us in a good spot in terms of coastal resiliency. In a lot of cases, that permanent protection is the best option for preserving the integrity of dunes. And so it's, I think we're in a good spot in terms of the amount of land that's publicly protected. And I think that our communities along the coast, all of the communities in Northwest Michigan prioritize environmental protection and preservation in their master plans. It's something that we've discovered over the last couple of years, is that that's a nearly universal priority. But particularly along the coast, people take environmental resources really seriously, and our master plan language in Northwest Michigan really emphasizes preservation and protection of our coastal areas and water resources. So that's something that we're really grateful for in Northwest Michigan. We have another question here. What's the likelihood of funding for digitizing this data for other parts of the state? That one I don't think I'm qualified to answer, but I think we have had some conversations about how this might be expanded into a statewide project in the future. We kind of took this one on as a pilot project to see how, what we'd be dealing with in terms of data availability and other resources. So it is something that has come up and is likely a priority. John, do you have anything you want to add to that?
The only thing I would add is well said, and that we did put in a proposal to CZM as one option, and hopefully, they'll, it's a very competitive process, but we are at least putting ourselves in the position to be funded to do that, to do just what you asked, which is do this for the rest of the state. We also want to be able to say a little bit more about each of these sites. It's one thing to see sort of an aerial image and some subtyping of dunes within a site, but what does it look like, and what's there, and what are the issues, what are the threats, what's the history of the site? We'd love to be able to do that for each of at least the important sites within each region of the state. And I think another thing that's really important is what kind of condition are these sites in. So it's one thing to say it's publicly owned or mostly publicly owned, but that doesn't mean it's in great condition, especially when you're dealing with a system that's really dynamic and responds pretty quickly to changes in the environment and changes to human use. And so, some of these sites, it's going to be pretty easy to talk about how intact and what kind of integrity or high integrity that they have. If you go out to some of the island sites that are really remote and hard to get to, that haven't really seen any type of a whole lot of human activity or mining or et cetera, those sites are pretty easily identified. But then when you get to the mainland, it's probably all over the board, and I don't think we have a really good handle on that. We do have a process here at MNFI where we try to give each occurrence of a natural community a grade from A to D. D not so good, A very good, and that process works pretty well for most communities, but for dune systems, like I said, we really just track the open portion of most of the dunes and wooded dune and swale complexes, and so there's a gap there, and it would be nice to be able to come up with some kind of a consistent process for evaluating the health of each dune site. So good question.
Okay, thanks, John. So just a couple minutes left, and I just want to also be sure to thank the Coastal Zone Management Program for helping us actually develop and complete this project. This wouldn't have come into being without the support of the Coastal Zone Management Program. So want to extend our appreciation for the DEQ's assistance in developing these resources that we think are going to be really helpful to local governments and other stakeholders moving forward. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending and for your patience as we kind of work through a couple bugs at the beginning. Again, all of the information is going to be available online at networksnorthwest.org/coastal resiliency, and it'll be an easy way for you to access the mapping resources that John showed you earlier. And we will include a copy of the presentation on the website as well. Thanks again, and feel free to contact us if you have any questions at all. Thanks, John.
Thank you, guys. Have a good rest of the day.